What does Mexican drug kingpin El Chapo, infamous serial killer Ted Bundy, and the trio of Frank Lee Morris and brothers Clarence and John Anglin have in common? They executed impressive prison breaks that are still talked about to this day. But there's a name that should be added to that list of infamy: Yoshie Shiratori. The man who escaped Japanese prisons a whopping 4 times in total, using various insane methods. To execute these berserk prison escapes, he used his superior intellect, superhuman strength, Spider-Man-like climbing abilities, contortionist-esque ability to dislocate his joints at will, and even Miso Soup. Strap yourself in for a ride on one of the craziest stories you've ever heard. This is the story of the Japanese Harry Houdini, Yoshie Shiratori. Born on 31 July 1907 in Aomori Prefecture, as a middle child, Yoshie didn't think he was destined for fame. His father passed away when he was very young, and his mother took his older brother to live with a farmer in Akita Prefecture, effectively abandoning him and his sister. Fortunately, his aunt took pity on them, and they were raised in a tofu store. To show their gratitude, Yoshie and his sister helped out in the store and dutifully carried out their chores. In an attempt to pay off the debt his father left behind, Yoshie took a job on a Russian ship catching crabs. He was 18 at this point. A few years later, he met and fell in love with a woman in the village. They got married and had a daughter together. Unfortunately, money was still a problem for Yoshie, and with the financial burden of a child added, things soon got much more difficult for him and his wife. He turned to gambling and thievery to get his hands on cash, and sadly, he got addicted. On April 3, 1933, he robbed a merchandise dealer's storehouse along with a group of other thieves. There are conflicting reports on what happened during the theft. According to one source, a man named Takazo, a concerned shopper, stepped in to defend the store and chased the thieves down the street. There was a struggle between the 3 men, and Takazo was stabbed and died. It's unclear to what degree Yoshie was involved in this scuffle. He, along with one of his accomplices, went into hiding, but the Aomori police tracked down the accomplice 2 years later. This person immediately snitched on Yoshie, telling the police where he was. He caught wind of the police's advancement in the case and had to choose between going on the run and putting his life in the hands of the law. Yoshie chose the latter, and he handed himself to the police, and that was a mistake. He insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder and only went to police to receive punishment for the theft. Yoshie also claimed that the police tortured him to get him to confess. It's unclear the sentence he got for this, but it's likely that his sentence was between 10 and 15 years to life. Finding accurate information about what Japanese prisons are really like is quite a challenge, but from snippets across the internet, it can be assumed that they're safe for inmates as well as those guarding them. That wasn't always the case though, back in the 20th century. Japanese prisons were terrible during this time. It wasn't uncommon for prisoners to try and escape as quickly as possible. Although things improved by the time Yoshie was imprisoned, the system still had a long way to go. He was sentenced to Aomori prison, where he faced harsh treatment by the prison guards. They would beat him and torture him every night. Feeling like the justice system had let him down, Yoshie didn't plan to spend his time in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. So while he was sitting in prison, he started to pay close attention to the guards' shifts. After a few months of monitoring, he learned that there was a 15-minute gap in their patrol time in the morning. In these precious few minutes, there would be no guards around his cell, which would give him enough time to make an escape. But first, he had to prepare for his escape. This couldn't be something that he just made up as he went along. He began by smuggling a metal wire from the bathhouse, possibly from a wash bucket, into his room. He then dedicated his time to secretly picking the lock of his cell door. After finding that it was easy enough, he waited for the right time. He also made a habit of ignoring the guards. Although this got him more than a few beatings, it was all part of his master plan. The right time came, and at 5:30 a.m. on one morning, he made his move. He had picked the lock to his cell. After he had picked the lock to his cell, Yoshie faced more locked doors between himself and freedom. This time he had easier access to the lock, and he could pick it effortlessly. He was able to make it out of the facility without being noticed, but he wasn't free just yet. At this point, Yoshie was still well within the search perimeter, and the alarm could go off at any moment, which would lead to his capture almost instantly. When 5:45 a.m. rolled around, it was time for the guards to make their rounds and ensure everything was okay within the cells. A guard peered into Yoshie's cell and he saw the prisoner sound asleep in his futon bed. Or more accurately, he saw what he thought was the prisoner sound asleep in his futon bed. What the guard was actually looking at was nothing more than loose floorboards piled on each other underneath Yoshie's duvet. The boards were placed in such a way to mimic a body lying quietly and sleeping. You may be wondering how it was possible for the guards not to notice one of their prisoners was gone. Well, remember how Yoshie liked to ignore the guards? They simply thought he was up to his old antics again and left him in his cell to sulk under his duvet after reprimanding him. All of this may sound like a stupid idea, something a silly teenager does in a movie to fool their parents when they sneak out at night, but it worked so well that no one knew anything was amiss until the next morning. When a guard had enough, he entered the cell to discipline Yoshie, but found floorboards instead of a man in the futon. The alarm was sounded, but Yoshie was long gone by then. A search party was sent to find him, but they returned empty-handed a few hours later. Word was spread about a vicious and dangerous criminal who had escaped and was now stalking the streets, on the lookout for his next victim. In reality, Yoshie wasn't in the village anymore. He had fled to the mountains and ate whatever he could forage. Only days later, Yoshie entered a hospital, looking for supplies to survive. A vigilant doctor noticed him, and he was soon recaptured after they called the police. After months of planning, he was back in the slammer, only experiencing 3 days of freedom. This time, his punishment would be much harsher. Yoshie was handed a life sentence for his escape attempt, and with his new sentence came a ticket to Miyagi prison. He spent 3 years there before he was transferred to Kosuge in Tokyo. Then, one of the biggest events in world history happened. World War II. This affected Yoshie's prison experience, and because of this, he was sent to Akita prison. In Akita prison, prisoners didn't get to spend all their time indoors. Nope, they have to go and do manual labor. This was a much harsher place than Aomori prison, and prisoners had to sleep on the cold concrete floors. There wasn't the luxury of tatami mats. It was even worse for Yoshie since he now had a reputation as a prisoner to watch, thanks to his previous escape. The guards decided it would be best to lock him up in solitary confinement most of the time. Akita prison's solitary confinement cells were made to be uncomfortable and deter any thoughts of escape. As such, Yoshie was forced to wear handcuffs at all times, even when he was sleeping. He didn't even get a window this time round, with just a single skylight way out of reach. It was like the prison cell was mocking him, letting him see some light come in but never allowing him an actual view. The guards, determined to not look foolish like their counterparts at Aomori, treated Yoshie very poorly. They would beat him up regularly, and he couldn't even try and defend himself since he was handcuffed all the time. The head guard, known only as Kobayashi, didn't join in on these beatings and sometimes even checked in on Yoshie. Kobayashi was there to do his job, not abuse his power and treat those who he should be looking after like they were less than him. Yoshie looked up to Kobayashi and eventually considered him something akin to a friend. Despite this small kindness, the prison was a nightmarish place for all criminals, including Yoshie. At the end of the day, it was still Yoshie Shiratori, and he would find a way to escape once again. The odds were not in his favor, as the cell walls were made of copper and impossibly smooth, but this didn't deter Yoshie. Every night he would lockpick his cuffs with a wire and scale the walls. After he would scale the walls, he would reach the skylight and hit it repeatedly to loosen the rotten wooden frame holding it together. This didn't happen overnight, of course, and he had to spend months scaling the wall and getting the wood to break on the skylight. Then he waited. He needed the right conditions to ensure that he didn't get caught immediately, so 3 months after being imprisoned in Akita prison, Yoshie made his move. On one night when it was late at night around midnight, and when there was a serious thunderstorm going on, Yoshie scaled the walls for the last time, broke the wood of the skylight, and crawled through the hole. He then set off on foot. Claps of thunder distracted the guards and the heavy rainfall prevented his footsteps from being heard. He rushed through the bad weather, using it as a clever cover for his escape, and soon he was gone. This time, the escape artist was able to evade the police for months. However, his faith in humanity and the law would cost him dearly. 3 months later, when the rain was pouring down again, much like on the night Yoshie escaped for the second time, head prison guard Kobayashi heard a knock on his door at his home. When he opened up the door, he must have thought he was dreaming because in front of him, soaking wet, stood Yoshie Shiratori. Yoshie was probably the last person he expected to see since the distance from Akita to his home was 333 miles. He let the escaped prisoner into his home and offered him something to drink and eat. Yoshie explained that he traveled to Kobayashi's place under the cover of darkness and ate whatever he could forage or steal. He also said that he was tired of running and he just wanted fairness. He just wanted to be treated with dignity. Since he arrived at Akita prison, he had been tortured and beaten, and he wanted to bring his plight, as well as that of other prisoners, to the light. He asked Kobayashi to help him seek legal protection and tell the government what was happening in Japan's prisons. Yoshie's grand plan was to hand himself over to the Justice Department, where he then could personally make a case for how corrupt and barbaric the Japanese prison system was, and ask for much needed reform. He knew that no one would listen to a fugitive who had escaped from prison twice. That's why he needed Kobayashi's help. Someone who was as respected as him would have a better chance of being taken seriously. Yoshie needed the head security to basically vouch for him. Kobayashi agreed and told Yoshie to go and take a warm shower. However, while he was cleaning off months of grime and dirt, the head prison guard called the authorities. It didn't take long for them to arrive at Kobayashi's home and arrest Yoshie. After being betrayed by the one person he thought he could understand his situation, he vowed never to trust any officer of the law again. And back to prison he went. By now, Yoshie had become a legend. Newspapers reported on his successful escapes that were followed by his less than successful attempts at avoiding recapture. It was only natural that authorities were not fans of his behavior, and they wanted to make an example of him. This meant that he would go to Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, notorious for being a high-security, no-nonsense prison. Abashiri is known as Japan's Alcatraz, thanks to how impossible it is to escape. This was Japan's northernmost prison, and it was unbelievably cold and got lots of snow. Thanks to the icy weather and thin uniforms, prisoners hardly even considered trying to escape. Well, all but Yoshie, who still wasn't very happy about being locked up in such dire conditions. Yoshie got 3 years added to his prison sentence. Immediately upon entering his cell, Yoshie was almost paralyzed by the cold. He tried to force himself past the guards, maybe driven by desperation, but didn't even get out of his cell. The guards quickly pushed him back and beat him down. Angry and defiant, Yoshie stood up and promised that he would break out of this prison as well, just as he had did with others. Feeling especially cheeky, he even added that the guards could do nothing about it. He said that putting handcuffs on him was pointless, as he would just lockpick them, or break them with his sheer strength. Yoshie gave the guards an example of this as he ripped apart the chains of his handcuffs, displaying brute raw power no one expected from him. Apparently, Yoshie's body was as strong as his mind and desire to be free. While this was surely impressive, showing the guards what he was capable of wasn't the smartest move. Now that they knew that normal handcuffs wouldn't cut it, he had to be given extra special treatment. Yoshie was fitted with heavy iron restraints around his ankles and wrists. These weren't normal handcuffs that could be lockpicked. There were no locks. Only blacksmiths could remove them, and because of the thick metal bolt locking the restraints in place, it would take 2 people to remove them. The restraints weighed over 40 pounds. Some reports indicate that the restraints were so tight and removed so rarely that Yoshie's wrists and ankles became infested with maggots. Yoshie seemed to have accepted his fate and spent his time lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling as if a hole would form and set him free once more. But there were plans brewing in his mind, and he was slowly but surely working on his next escape. He wasn't allowed to work since he wasn't trusted, and his food rations were half of the normal fare. The prison wanted to make sure he knew that he was at the mercy of his caretakers. Prisoners were fed rice and miso soup, and understanding the value of salt in his soup, Yoshie would use it to work on his escape plan. Salt is an electrolyte, so when it's mixed with water, like in a soup, the resulting solution conducts electrons much quicker than normal water. The oxidation reaction happens faster, and if put on metal, it corrodes it faster too. He was a fisherman in his younger days, so he knew what salt could do to iron. Whenever he got his food, he would drip the miso soup on his iron shackles, and the salt wore down the metal over time. In other words, the salty miso soup was perfect for wearing down the metal bolts and facilitating his escape. It wouldn't happen instantly though, of course, and the process would have to be repeated regularly over time. After months of pouring miso soup on his specially made iron handcuffs, he was able to rust the shackles enough to slip out of them. Because they were black, the rust wasn't apparent, so the blacksmiths didn't notice anything when they had to remove the shackles at any given time. So now that he could free himself, the next obstacle was getting out of the cell. He noticed that the only opening was the feeding hatch in his cell, which was very small enough that Yoshie could only fit his head through it. However, on one fateful night, he resolved to escape again, and he dislocated his shoulder so he could slip through. After this, he made his way to the prison skylight, which he quickly shattered and used as an escape point. He was able to become the first and only prisoner to this day to escape Abashiri prison. Two guards on patrol heard a crash above them, and they looked up to see a darting figure disappear from view, and they quickly started to check which prisoner had escaped. When they reached Yoshii's cell, they saw a made bed with clothes folded neatly on top, and the special handcuffs were lying on the floor, and there was no sign of Yoshie. A search party was immediately sent out to try and find him, but after a few hours, they had to return with no good news. After that night, Yoshie went off the grid. He had no faith in the law or anyone working in the justice system, and returning to society would have been a great risk. He spent 2 years in the mountains, living on his own and surviving as best as he could. It's hard to know if he even saw another person during that time. However, even with all the experience that he had in solitary confinement, living so disconnected took its toll on Yoshie, and on one evening in 1946, he made his way into a nearby town, snuck past the local school, and found a newspaper. As he read, it dawned on him how much he has missed in the years since his last escape. After being isolated for so long, he didn't even know that Japan had lost the war. He was shocked to read that 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on the Japanese cities, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Maybe seeing life returning to normal, even after such a tragedy, gave him hope that his life too could do the same. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't continue living in the mountains alone, so he decided to head towards the nearby city of Sapporo and figure out his next steps. Things didn't go according to plan though. Along the way, he stumbled across a vegetable garden. Seeing the ripe tomatoes, it's very likely that Yoshii's stomach growled at the sight of them, since it had been a long time since he had enjoyed a proper meal. The owner of the garden saw and mistook Yoshie for one of the thieves who had been plundering his fields recently. He then chased Yoshie and attacked him. As Yoshie tried to defend himself, the gardener suffered a mortal wound and bled out, leading to his death. It's believed that he fell with his head against a rock. The commotion alerted local police, and the fugitive was quickly arrested again. His pleas of self-defense fell on deaf ears. This time, Yoshie was sentenced to death and sent to Sapporo prison. At this point, no one wanted to deal with Yoshie, but Sapporo prison was considered one of the best. Knowing everything they could learn about him, the guards kept permanent watch outside his cell. The room that he stayed in was reinforced as well and was searched every day for any signs of an escape being planned. The guards could never find anything, and Yoshie was actually behaving surprisingly well. He was so obedient that guards soon trusted him enough to forego handcuffs. Of course, they were very confident that there was no way he could escape. The only thing that made them a little bit suspicious was how he would keep looking up as if he was scanning for an exit. The guards knew that they couldn't take this matter lightly, as he had escaped via a skylight before. They decided to inspect the ceiling thoroughly once a week when Yoshie was bathing, and they found nothing. And yet, on April 1, 1947, Yoshie escaped prison one last time. Once again, he had outsmarted everybody. His ceiling staring was nothing more than a diversion. He had been working on an escape tunnel the entire time. It turned out that the authorities had forgotten to fortify the bottom since they were so worried about him breaking out through a window or skylight. Ironically, this turned out to be his easiest and simplest escape because all he had to do was dig his way out of there using a miso soup bowl and miscellaneous silverware after removing the bolted floorboards, which wasn't easy, but he had expertise. Over a month passed throughout this, and the fact that the guards did not detect this method and the floorboard panels were replaced each night after excavating allowed him to hide his operations. A search team was dispatched and they returned empty-handed. After escaping prison for the 4th time, he returned to life in the mountains. He spent the next 9 months hiding away in an abandoned mine and avoiding capture. He survived on berries and wild rabbits. On 19 January 1948, he found his way to Kotoni-cho near Sapporo. There, he was spotted by a police officer on patrol. Looking like someone who might be up to something suspicious, the officer asked for his name. Yoshie responded with Komura, and the officer asked to look inside his bag. Yoshie obliged, revealing bowls, kettles, and pots. The officer found nothing wrong with Yoshie, and in a gesture that touched Yoshie, the officer offered him a cigarette. Cigarettes were a luxury in Japan at this time, and Yoshie saw this gesture as heartwarming. After smoking, Yoshie admitted that he was not Komura, and shared that he was an escaped convict who fled from Sapporo prison. For him, the simple act of kindness that was shown by the officer had been something he hadn't experienced in a long time, especially from law enforcement. He decided it was time to set things right. Yoshie followed the police officer to Sapporo police station, and there he awaited his trial. Things were different this time though. The judge presiding over the case recognized that the farmer's murder was self-defense and not a malicious act. It was then decided that his death penalty would be revoked. The judge also noted that despite his escapes from prison, and even in the face of mistreatment, Yoshie never once tried to hurt the guards. As a result, the judge gave him a revised sentence of 20 years imprisonment and granted his request to serve his time at Fuku prison in Tokyo. During his final stint behind bars, Yoshie was treated with respect and he didn't try to escape. He behaved well and was released early in 1961. While out of prison, he survived by doing odd jobs and finally was reunited with his daughter. Yoshie was able to live out his final years in freedom in Aomori before he passed away from a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 71. His ashes were buried in a grave overlooking Mount Fuji. Yoshie Shiratori was seen as an anti-hero in Japan, and his prison break escapades naturally fascinated the public. His legacy he left behind was so massive that he inspired many publications across books, film, manga, and anime. The legacy left behind by him is truly insane, yet motivating and slightly sad. However, the legacy left behind by murderer Tatsuya Ichihashi is truly sickening, as he murdered an innocent British girl in Japan. If you want to see a video on this murder, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching.